Hello and a really big warm welcome to this presentation from the Urban Penguin. My name is Andrew Mallett and today we're going to take a look at configuring our HTTPD server to deliver Git so our version control system is accessible over the web. As our demonstration operating system, we'll be using Rocky Linux 8.10 and we'll be installing the Apache web server. So come on, let's find a command line. So really big warm welcome through to the command line of my Rocky Linux 8 system. When we run the hostname ctl command, we can be quite clear about what we are running, and you can see that it's Rocky Linux 8.10. Now this of course is based around Red Hat Enterprise Linux and has SE Linux installed. It is enabled and I would always prefer to leave it enabled. When we check this, we can see get enforce, and we can see that we are in the SE Linux enforcing mode. And I think this is always a good sign because you want to be running this in the most secure way that you can. Having said that, we're going to be keeping this as simple as possible, so we won't be configuring our web server any more than we need, and we won't be putting on HTTPS. Another really useful feature is being able to clone the repository that I have set up for this video. So we can go through and git clone HTTPS, looking through to github.com and running through to my repositories, so the Urban Penguin. And if I recall correctly, I've called this git-httpd. So we can clone this. We can move into our directory and we should be able to see there isn't a huge amount here, but it gives you the individual steps and the configuration file that we are using. So the steps are the step-by-step instructions that we see within the video. The git.conf is the web configuration file that we'll be adding to the Apache server. Now I won't be running through the steps as a shell script, because that would kind of spoil things. You wouldn't necessarily understand what's going on. But as a reference, it's not bad to have. And we can see that the first step is to install Git, which we know we already have, the HTTP daemon, and so that we can manage our file system policies, we've got the policy core utils being added in, and that's for SE Linux. So we can go through then and run through the installation. I'll just cut it short a little bit because it's not that interesting watching, but also it doesn't take that long to run through, but a little bit was cut out. The next stage is going to be editing the git.conf. Now obviously I have the file, so I'm just going to copy that across, but we will step you through the contents of that Apache configuration file. So let me just go through and copy that across to the correct location. So the git.conf needs to go through and be added into our etc, httpd and conf.d directory. And I'm just going to leave it at the name git.conf. That's going to work well for me. But as I say, we do need to understand what we've done. The video isn't going to be very useful if you say copy this configuration across. So you can see that we set some environment variables at the top. /repos is the directory that we're going to create in a few moments where our Git repositories will exist. It will hold possibly more than one repository, so we want to tell Git that we're going to be exporting everything within the repos directory. That's then going to work with a back-end script. So we're putting a script alias. So anything that's being run from within inside of the repos directory is going to be running scripts inside of USR, libexec, git core, and git HTTP backend. That's all part of git core, so it was installed when we put in or installed the git RPM. We're allowing then that directory to execute CGI scripts, and we're setting up then our repos directory. And again, we're saying that CGI scripts can be run from our repos directory. We've set up a location for repos as well, where we're enabling WebDAV, so our distributed authoring and versioning tools. That's a module that's installed by default. And of course, you can see we are then setting up authentication. So you will need to add a username and password when accessing the repos directory. Our users are going to be stored in the git.parsetwd directory, but of course you could set up authentication to use LDAP or other authentication sources. So I can go through then and just jump out of the file. So that's been configured. We've copied that across. When we go through and look at the rest of the steps, we can see that we need to go through and set up our password file. And we're creating a user called Bob. Obviously, you don't have to create a user called Bob. Why not be a devil and create a user called Alice? Here we're using htpasswd-c, so we're creating it. That's only done for the first user. If you are adding subsequent users, just use htpasswd. Don't use the -c, because it will be overwriting the file every time. But there you go, we've got our user and password created. You can see that we're now creating the directory /repos, making sure that it's owned by the Apache user and the Apache group, configuring our SE Linux file content with read-write access for the HTTP daemon, and making sure that once we've set that in the backend policy, that policy is restored through to the repos directory. And then, of course, we enable our HTTP daemon. So let me just add these lines in. And then our web server now is up and running. And we're going to have the correct permissions that are set on our repos directory. I can probably leave this script now, but I do want to just grab something whilst I'm here. We do need to configure my Git client to have a user email and a username. I'm just using the default values, so I'm going to quickly paste this in, but this then will allow me to do the git push to prove that we can write back to this later. But this is just configuring the Git client, and it doesn't really matter the order in which it is set. So I can move then into the repos directory. And whilst we're here, we can actually double check some of the work that has been done. So if I clear the screen, and then we can do an ls-l, the uppercase Z and D for the current directory, and we're able then to see that it's owned by Apache in the Apache group, and we can see that we've got the correct SE Linux content. Obviously, the web server needs both read and write access to this directory. We can then run sudo, but changing through to my Apache user, I'm going to create a new repository. So git init, and then --bare, so it can be seen to be empty, and then test.git. So that's then the new repository created. It's going to be the subdirectory test.git. And again, if I then go through and list the current directory, we're able to see that test.git has been created with the correct SE Linux content and, of course, the correct Apache ownership. So all of our work seems to be doing quite well. Our repository is created and it should be accessible via the web. So I can go through then back to my home directory as the Vagrant user using git clone. And I say we've only set this up really simply, so we'll be using HTTP, but of course there's nothing stopping you configuring HTTPS. And we can look at localhost /repos. So that's our top level directory. And then all of our repositories underneath should be shared out. We can put in then our username and password for the web server. So in my case, it's Bob. And hopefully I can remember the password. Now we get a warning telling me there was nothing in the repository, but we know that we created a bare repository. But if I now move into that directory, so it's just going to be called test. And when I run then the ls-a, the contents of the repository is stored in the .git directory. We didn't have any actual files, so we only get the repository management directory .git. We can create a new file. I just call it README. And then we can run our normal git add. And then our git commit. I can run the git commit because I've now created my git user name and user email. And we can just say it's our first commit. So that's all working locally. We're not really testing anything until we do our git push. So we're pushing back to the web server now. We can put in our username and password, and we can see now that we've created the new branch master on the server. So we now have content on our Git repository. But we've been able to show that we can use a web server, and our web server can deliver our version control system Git. We didn't have to do a whole heap because the Git client included the Git backend HTTPD scripts. But when we look, we can move back into my home directory and look at the cloned repository, and we can see the steps. So these are the steps that we've carried out, the steps that you've seen in the video, and the web configuration file that we added to Apache is our git.conf. And again, then you can see what was needed to get our demo up and running. So I hope the files will help, but we can also go through and summarize here, setting up your Git HTTP daemon on Rocky Linux with Apache, making sure your version control system then is able to work with SE Linux enabled.
All that is left to say is thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, then you are probably sadder than I first thought. For more of this drivel, please subscribe, like and comment to @TheUrbanPenguin.